My name is Dr. Heather Brunskell-Evans and I'm a philosopher and sociologist. Today I'm interviewing James Caspian about the issue of free speech. James has been in the news quite a lot in the past few months around free speech, so James, I wonder whether you could introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you, Heather. Well, I'm a psychotherapist in private practice and I have a particular interest in Jungian psychology, which informs my work. I've been a trustee of the Beaumont Trust for 17 years up until 2018, and I worked for 10 years in a medical and clinical setting with people who are undergoing gender transition.
James, I wonder whether you can tell me why it is that you've become such a media personality, as it were, in the past few months in relation to the issue both of free speech and your career as a Jungian psychotherapist.
Well, in 2015 I began as part of a master's degree a study into people who reversed gender transition, and initially people who reversed gender reassignment surgery. The university that I was at 2 years later told me that I couldn't carry on with that research. They said that to undertake research that was potentially politically incorrect, my commas, would possibly incite criticism on social media, and criticism of the research would be criticism of the university, and furthermore it is better not to upset people. So I then took legal advice and was advised that they may be breaking the law, and since then I've been involved in a legal action taking Bath Spa University to court for judicial review of that decision, and that is ongoing at the moment.
I find this absolutely fascinating. Of course, it's got many different aspects to it, but today I wonder whether you can explain something that I think you make connections between what happened at the university, what has happened with the surrounding issues, and what is happening on social media. I think you analyse that in relation to a sort of Jungian framework, which is your training, and that there is something going on here in relation to Jung's concept of the dark shadow. Am I right in thinking that?
Yes, I think you're thinking along the right lines as to what I've been thinking about.
Yeah.
So first of all, I think it's hard not to notice that the concept of free speech, that within the law one has the right to say what one thinks, to challenge opinions and views that one doesn't share, that all of that can be done in a lawful and hopefully civilised way, that has been one of the cornerstones of our democracy.
Absolutely.
It's upon which our government is based, our institutions and so on.
Yes.
And that in recent years people have been increasingly finding that they feel and experience that that right is being compromised and in some way being suppressed.
Yes.
And I think the refusal to let me continue with my research falls into that category.
Right.
That we should have the right to research a subject which some people are uncomfortable with, because essentially that's what they're saying, that some people might be uncomfortable with your research and they might not like it and they might criticise it. Well, I think that part of research is that it does come under criticism. I think that's what happens with research. It's perfectly normal.
Yes.
But what is relatively new is the idea that you mustn't offend people and so therefore you can't say it or you can't do it.
Yes.
And people are increasingly experiencing that, and on social media, but in other forums as well.
Yes.
And when I give trainings, and I for many years gave transgender awareness trainings to the public and private sector, and I would tell people about some of the controversies that I was encountering, because as you know, in my preliminary research I discovered more and more young people transitioning and then regretting it and detransitioning, and I particularly wanted to research that because it hadn't been looked into in any depth.
James, I find that really interesting what you've talked about in terms of the suppression of free speech, and as you know I have some experience of the suppression of my own free speech and my own research But what I'm interested in is how you interpret that in relation to Jung's concept of the shadow. If you could explain that to me.
Mm-hmm. Well, Jung, who was the psychiatrist who originally worked with Freud and then went on to develop his own analytical psychology, had a number of concepts which I find very useful to work with in my own work and life, and also looking at this kind of issue.
Yeah.
So Jung said that everybody has a shadow, individually and collectively. So individually, everybody has an aspect of themselves or aspects of themselves which we repress, we hide, which we push into the unconscious.
Right.
So then we're not aware of them.
Right.
We're not aware of them. These qualities, which can be good qualities, positive qualities,
Yes.
as well as elements which we find unpleasant, they're hidden from our ego, our conscious selves. So the failure to recognise and deal with the shadow, with these repressed parts of ourselves, is often at the root of problems between individuals, between groups, and within organisations. And repressing it and being unconscious of it fuels prejudice, and it can spark off anything from a row between people to a war. So we're talking about something that's absolutely central to the conflicts that we experience in our own lives and within our world. So I think it's important to understand this concept and to come to terms with it. So
how would you then explain this in relation to conflicts around issues to do with transgenderism? How do you apply that concretely to this context?
Well, I'd like to explain it in terms of the collective.
Okay.
So you're talking about something that at this time is a very high-profile issue.
Yes.
But you could equally apply what I'm saying to any issue that becomes
Yes,
a conflict
I
or any
understand.
war.
I
So
understand.
I'd like to talk about it quite generally.
Okay.
So Jung said that as well as a personal unconscious, there is a collective unconscious. So in other words, there is an unconscious which is the kind of holding and repository of all of the repressed feelings and experiences and emotions and material from
Yes.
the human race collectively.
Yes.
And he then took that into the idea of that there were archetypes,
Yeah.
that there were kind of almost energy fields which are recognisable to all societies because they're collective, universally
Yes.
collective. So for instance, every society will have had goddess figures in one way or another,
Yes.
and they will come in different forms, but the archetypal energy behind them is the same. The great mother, the wise old man, the vulnerable child, the wicked witch. All of these are archetypal figures that you see over and over again in societies in all time. In our own society, these very often come in cinema, in films and in art. So the idea that there is a collective unconscious, you see this played out more amongst groups of people. The personal unconscious, say the shadow might be, say I am a very quiet, peaceful person, and my shadow contains a lot of rather loud anger, because that's something that I learned to repress, so I put it away from my consciousness. However, it is still there. So what Jung said was that we need to assimilate, we need to acknowledge it, we need to kind of acknowledge that it's there and assimilate it, that it's part of us, and then we are less likely to project it onto other people. But I would like to come back to the idea of the collective,
Yes.
because I want to give you some examples of where perhaps the collective aspects of the shadow have burst out and affected people in a very destructive way. So think of, say, 1970s Cambodia, and for people that can't remember that, in the 1970s in Cambodia, a very peaceful Buddhist country in the east,
Yes.
a vicious regime run by Pol Pot
Yes.
became active, and millions of people were murdered in a vicious genocide,
Yes. Yes.
a murderous, bloody and dreadful genocide. And
Yes.
so it's interesting that that came out of a country that was so peaceful. In a country with a culture like Cambodia,
Yes.
when you feel angry you smile, you don't
Yeah.
express it.
Yes.
So then it goes into the shadow, and then periodically
Yes.
it bursts out. I think you could say the same thing probably happened in Rwanda some years later,
Yes.
where neighbours from neighbouring tribes, Hutus and Tutsis, who had lived peaceably together for many years, suddenly were murdering each other with machetes, and people were hacking limbs off with machetes of people they'd been neighbours of. And somehow they were caught up in a kind of a madness. That's an example of the collective shadow just emerging in a very ugly way. So, yeah, I think I made my point that it's important that we become conscious enough of it that we don't get taken over by it.
I understand. So so in terms of psychological health, both for the individual and for the society, as I understand it, what you're saying is that we need to recognise the shadow, reflect on it, process it in some way, and in that sense, the damage that it could create is lessened by the recognition of it rather than the continually pushing it further and further into the shadows.
Yes, I think that's right, because if we see how that works in our more individual lives,
Yes.
If we don't do that, we project our shadow.
Okay.
So projection it's a psychological term
Yes.
for when I see something in you
Yes.
that reminds me somehow of my shadow, and I might not be very conscious of that at
Yes.
all,
Yes.
and I don't like it.
Yes.
In fact, I have a very strong reaction to it, a very gut solar plexus reaction to something that you display that I really don't want to know actually lurks in my shadow. And so then I attack you for it.
Yes.
I hate you,
Yes.
and you become the other, and you are bad.
Yes.
And of course you see that would have happened in Cambodia, that would have happened in Rwanda collectively. You can see it individually, just when you come across somebody that really gets to you, you think, why? Because other people might say, well, that doesn't bother me about that person, but it really bothers us because it's something in our shadow. So what Jung said was that if we acknowledge that, if we become aware, actually maybe I have some of that quality that I really hate in you, or that you're saying or expressing, it doesn't mean I have to act it out, it doesn't mean I have to go out there and do it, but it makes me a more whole person, because I can see that actually, of course, perhaps I'm full of contradictions and all shades of grey, I'm not just black and white.
So presumably then, in recognising it in oneself, then the damage that is done through not reflecting and just projecting out is minimised.
Yes, I would say that's right. It leads to self-acceptance and grievance and blame, because it can be behind a lot of blame.
Yes.
That can turn into taking responsibility for ourselves.
What I'd like to ask you, James, is that you've used some pertinent examples, but very extreme examples. For example, Cambodia. Now, for some reason, this form of analysis you think is applicable to your application to Bath Spa University, having being prevented from carrying out the research, and the reasoning behind the rationale behind why you were prevented from carrying out the research. So can you apply the kinds of analysis you've applied to those extreme political situations to the Bath Spa event, as it were? What are the dynamics going on there in terms of the shadow?
I think there are several things going on. I think, yes, the shadow is applicable. Also, Jung's idea of complexes is applicable as well, but I'll come on to that, because I think we need to talk about complexes in this as well.